With us today are three distinguished panelists and three KPMG partners, each of whom I'll take a minute to introduce. First, Martha Seiler, who's the Special Secretary of PPI from Brazil, Daniel Gomez, Senior Deputy Director, DNP from Colombia, and Rafael Ugaz, Executive Director, ProInversion, Peru. From KPMG, we have Ignacio Garcia de Fresno, who is head of KPMG's Mexican business for infrastructure, Fernando Faria, who is head of our Latin American infrastructure operation, and Andy Garbett, who is a partner in KPMG US. Most of the countries online today are still in recovery, but we wanted to bring you a little further along the line to resilience and resumption, because COVID offers us a unique opportunity through infrastructure to sow the seeds of future prosperity for generations to come, to improve each country's competitiveness, and to enhance services to our citizens. And we've been reaching out to a number of senior government officials over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and I would like Fernando Faria, if he can, to please give us a summary of where things are at and what the overwhelming sentiment is. Fernando, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for the opportunity, and welcome all of the speakers and participants to this webcast. What we wanted to discuss in this topic around the role of infrastructure to drive economic growth in the region post-COVID, to discuss that, we wanted to show you some of the results of a survey we conducted recently with public sector officials across the region. Now, this survey was done between March and April to respond to questions that were defined prior to COVID. So actually, this is quite useful because the answers are not, or the questions were not influenced by the situation we are living, but then the answers they came already when COVID started to be felt in Latin America. And in our survey, we've interviewed around 80 public sector officials throughout the region. In terms of the seniority of these officials, they typically are from manager and above, so quite senior in their own organizations, and we had also representatives from ministries across the region. Most of these public sector officials work on the federal level, but we also had representatives from states and municipalities and cities. And whilst most of them, again, are public sector and work for their specific governments, we also interviewed, although this is a smaller percentage, individuals that work in multilaterals, that are working with many governments in the region. So a good spread of capacity and experience, but all focused on infrastructure and with the public sector. In terms of the regions we've contacted and we received the responses, we had very good turnout from Brazil, Colombia, but also responses from across the region. We have Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, Panama, Peru, very well represented also. And then we had countries like Central America well represented with El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, all responding to this survey. Now, one of the things also that is interesting with this survey is that actually it's now 10 years we've produced a similar study with a global reach, which we've done together with The Economist. At the time, the name we gave was The Changing Face of Infrastructure, Public Sector Perspectives. And this was a global study. Latin America at that time had a small participation, around 4%, but we had something like 70% of the respondents came from the developed countries with experience in infrastructure like USA, UK, Australia, and some Canada and some other European countries. So in terms of the target of that study was different, but I think it would also be interesting for us and for the participants on this webinar to compare the results we've obtained with some of the questions we've done with those that we've done 10 years ago. Now, the first question we've done was around the stimulus money. And the question was the challenges that the public sector officials were seeing in their country, which created difficulties in effectively using stimulus money for infrastructure investment. And I think this is a very timely question, because when we speak about COVID, we also speak of the role of the government to put forward stimulus packages. And I think we all agree that infrastructure will be one of the key priorities of those stimulus packages. So this question also highlights what are the issues that public sector officials were seeing even before COVID. And the answer that was most voted was clearly the processes that were too slow. A view that, okay, I have the stimulus money, but I take a lot of time to get the approval to put these projects going. And this was the most voted one. And the second one was around the project preparation. So the view that, okay, I have these funds available, but my projects are not sufficiently prepared to receive those funds. And those were the two main responses we got. And when we compare with the results 10 years ago, not much different. Again, with 50% of the responses, very similar to this one. We had the slow approval processes as the most voted item raised by public sector officials. And yes, the second one was not project preparation. This is something that we're seeing more highlighted in LATAM than we see globally 10 years ago. But nevertheless, the similarity on the item related with the slow approval processes. The second question we've done was, in the view of the public sector officials, what were the major impediments in public sector for more infrastructure investment? And clearly, again, the most voted item was the lack of financial resources. Clearly, the view that we got from public sector officials across the region is there's a number of projects that require significant government resources, and those resources are not available. Again, I think this is quite timely because, again, we speak about stimulus packages, but most of the resources that governments have available, that are not much, they are being used on these emergency, and therefore the ability to raise more funds to then put forward infrastructure projects is an issue highlighted by the respondents to the survey. And the second point was around the lack of a long-term infrastructure plan. So the view of the public sector officials is that actually without a long-term infrastructure plan, then it's difficult to implement infrastructure investments because the priorities are not clear. And this was the second item that was included in the responses. And finally, a view that many times the infrastructure priorities are politicized in the sense that it changes with governments, and that prioritization does not reflect solely technical analysis. Again, when we look 10 years ago, not very different. These would be exactly the three main top items that were raised and highlighted 10 years ago in the survey which we've done at the time. The third question was, okay, we have these issues. What are the levers we have to improve infrastructure investment, and what would be the initiatives that would clearly impact the ability to invest more in infrastructure in the country. And there we had a close first, and second, we had depolitization of public policies around infrastructure, very connected with the previous question, as being the item that public sector officials thought that by depolitizing, we would be able to improve infrastructure investment in the country. Second, capacity building. So public sector officials across the different agencies, all that are involved somehow in infrastructure planning and delivery, should receive more training and better training as the second item. And then the third item, a view from the public sector that we should be using more public-to-private partnerships as a way to improve infrastructure investment in the country. Then we had a number of other items. I'm keen to highlight one, which came well voted, and actually this was not raised 10 years ago. So clearly a change we're seeing in the market, and I think it's a very good change. And I think COVID highlights the importance of ESG and measuring the wider impact that project generates. Again, this has not been a top priority of all of the answers, but getting 18 votes there, I think this is something that, again, for us, it's a very good sign, and it was not raised 10 years ago. The top three, yes, those are exactly the same three main items that were raised 10 years ago around depolitization of public policies, around infrastructure, better training, and more use of PPPs. Those were exactly the three also that came top of the list 10 years ago, which is actually quite interesting. And then when exploring more the question around, okay, a view that we should be using more the private sector and PPPs, we've made the specific question around, okay, if the respondents consider that the private sector can help in improving efficiency in infrastructure delivery. And here, a clear majority of more than 90% responded yes. And this was the question where we found more differences with the study that we've done 10 years ago. And probably this is not too surprising. 10 years ago, 26% of the people said that the private sector would not bring more efficiency. 65% said that yes, it could bring more efficiency. Here we're talking about 92% saying that the private sector will be more efficient. And I think this has to do with a view first that in the developed world, where most of the audience of the previous study, there was already a lot of infrastructure investment, so the need to have the private sector was not clear. I think when we look at emerging markets and in Latin America, I think the need of infrastructure is so obvious that people recognize that without the private sector, it will be impossible to meet the targets and to bridge the gap that currently exists. So interesting to do this comparison. Probably not surprising, but it's good to have the numbers that show exactly the sentiment, because any solution now in terms of developing infrastructure in the region will clearly rely on the private sector. But to discuss these, we've presented these results also as a teaser to the debate we're very keen to have with our speakers. And to lead that debate, I will pass the word to Nacho Presno, my colleague. Nacho, to you.
Many thanks, Fernando. We are fortunate to have with us representatives from 3 countries that are doing important reforms to accelerate infrastructure investment. And I have to be the bad guy to control the clock in a very, very interesting debate. And to start it, I am keen to have the views of each one of the survey results and how applicable they are to their own countries. Marta, can you share your views? And then I would ask Daniela and Rafael. We have approximately 3 minutes for each one. And I'm sorry I have to stop you at any time. Marta, please, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Thank you hi to my colleagues, Danielle, Rafael. It's a pleasure to be here and explain a bit about PPI, Brazilian Investment Program. And yes, we've been doing a lot of homework considering the reforms agenda. I can say that the Social Security reform has been probably the most important reform Brazil has been through for many years. And why was it so important and why is it linked to what we're talking here today? Is because if Brazil hadn't done the homework and approved this reform, we probably wouldn't have any condition to go forward with the public investment agenda and even other important public policies in Brazil. So it was very important to rebalance, let's say, the public accounts in Brazil, and this reform was an important answer of the country, the Congress, and also the Brazilian government to show that we are going to be responsible on the fiscal side to make sure we can go on forward with public investments as well. But the main agenda in Brazil today to recover investments is to bet on partnerships, concessions, PPPs, privatizations. We believe it is important to have public investment and public policies. It's a very big country. We have a lot to do, but we really trust that we will only get to the level of investments that we need to have in Brazil to grow on a considerable rate if we have a lot of private investment in transportation, logistics. So we've been doing a lot on this side to attract those investments. And considering the reforms agenda, the Brazilian Congress has been debating and approving very important laws also in this infrastructure side, let's say. So we had in the recent past telecommunications new law. We had a new law for regulatory agencies in Brazil also approved. We had the law for economic freedom, which was an important project showing that Brazil is moving to a more liberal agenda and trying to reduce bureaucracy, trying to reduce the size of the state and its burden on the taxpayers. And we're discussing right now in Brazil very advanced project for basic sanitation, opening the market of basic sanitation for private investments, national and international investments. And we really believe this is going to be a game changer in Brazil so that we have more investments in basic sanitation, water, sewage. We already have many projects going on, feasibility studies, PPPs that are being structured. And we believe that in the next weeks in Brazil, we'll have this important bill approved, which will bring many investments to our country in this sector that is so important for Brazilians' health. And now we're dealing with a big health crisis, and I wish we had already gone through this legislation before and we were having more investments in sanitation today. It would help us a lot to go through COVID challenge if we had done the right investments in basic sanitation before, but we're working a lot on that. I believe it's a very important reform that will happen in Brazil in the next weeks. And other important sectors such as the gas market, we're opening also the gas market for private investments, making legislation more simple to attract those investments. We're discussing the PPP legislation to have more modern legislation, also legislation for the energy sector, for privatizations, and we're also focusing on green bonds to have more incentives for, let's say, green and sustainable infrastructure. So I can end here saying that the reforms agenda is moving very fast and in a very consistent way in Brazil, and will for sure bring good results for us to grow after this actual crisis.
Thank you very much, Marta. I'm sure we will get back to a couple of topics you mentioned earlier. Daniel, we're keen to hear you as you start explaining us what you're doing in your country and how you're undertaking the COVID crisis and the planning, etc.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much all for the invitation. A very relevant conversation. The infrastructure and transport sector will definitely play a key role during recovery from the deceleration and the recession caused by the measures to stop the spread of the COVID. So we do face lots of challenges. I would first want to mention that in Colombia, we've realized that during this crisis that a lot of the measures that we were planning, that we were working on, were well conceived, but they need to be accelerated. So the tools that we have need to be sped up, and this kind of resonates with your survey questions and the point of approval speeds, of project preparation, bottlenecks of data. I think that it's very rare to be able to speak about shovel-ready projects because it is hard. It is hard to find a project where you can actually spend fiscal stimulus money effectively and react with sectors. You do have to have planning, structuring, and a whole process that makes sure that we do spend those resources adequately. So that's one bottleneck, but fortunately, and I think it's fortunate from the planning point of view that we have been approving a set of policies recently since January this year. First, national logistics policy that emphasizes the need to invest in intermodality, so to spend not only on roads, but also on waterways, on rail, on airports, and to achieve that linkage between all these modes of transportation to reduce trade costs, to reduce logistics costs. That policy also has a big component on trade facilitation. So with this policy, we do hope to, make additional investments on the infrastructure itself, but also on all the services attached to infrastructure. The second policy that we recently approved was the urban and regional mobility policy. So this also has a very interesting component on infrastructure access to cities and also to linkages between cities and mobility within cities. So of course, in the context of COVID, it's a key topic to rethink how we organize our transportation and infrastructure services within cities and how we can improve the quality of life in cities through better investments, greener investments, more sustainable infrastructure investments. And finally, right now, we are working on a very important policy about value capture. Since 2003, I believe, we don't have a national value capture policy. We do have a local value capture, but this, of course, responds to another question on the survey about financing. A big challenge in terms of mobilizing capital towards these investments. We have in total plans for over 300 billion pesos in investments in projects for the next years. So we definitely need to think about how to mobilize new resources, and value capture can be one of those ways. Public-private partnerships, definitely a key ingredient. Also one of the questions on the survey. We have our PPP policy dating from 2012 in Colombia. It's been fairly successful in pushing forward a big portfolio of large highway investments, the 4G program. With the 4G program, we have 29 projects, out of which 19 have already financial closure. So they are on the way. We're planning the fifth generation projects, 5G. And of course, in the context of intermodality, we have plans to invest in our waterways, big rivers in Colombia that can be used for transportation, on airports, on urban transportation, the subways, the metro systems, the BRT systems, regional roads, and very important, and I think it's an interesting case of how planning is working, and it relates also with your point on ESGs. We have a fairly ambitious rural roads program where we used satellite images to identify through artificial intelligence to map all the inventory of rural roads. And with this inventory, we designed a set of criteria, including social, economic impact, impact on intermodality, impact on productivity, impact on environment. And with this, we managed to rank our rural roads so we could have a plan to actually invest in those roads. So right now, in the middle of the COVID crisis, we actually do have a plan with practically shovel-ready projects that can be very effective in the recovery process with employment, local employment, with connectivity to the large highways, because we had the investments in the 19 big highway projects, but we lacked the connectivity with the centers of production. So this was kind of missing, and this big rural roads project will have investments for 1 billion pesos during the next year that it will really push forward recovery. And to close this first intervention, I would like to also mention how we are pushing forward with the PPP, with the public-private-ship programs, in the same sense as Marta mentioned, of exploring new ways to use our PPP law for sectors that are not only transport infrastructure. So we are using the scheme for all sorts of different infrastructures, urban infrastructures, parks, educational infrastructure, health infrastructure. So you name it, there's a big portfolio of projects. We're reviewing our risk-sharing guidelines. This is very important for the recovery as well, putting up to date all our discount factors, all our risk-sharing guidelines, and this as well is an interesting exercise that we're currently working on. So I think that to wrap this intervention up, the state of emergency has really highlighted the need to speed up a lot of the reforms that we were thinking about. We were planning them for a couple of years, and now we need to speed them up. We need to find the financing. We need to reach out to the private sector, not only for financing, but for private sector capabilities. And we need to focus on both of the big highways, but also intermodality, other modes of transportation, and the smaller roads that connect people to markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. That was very, very extensive, and you touch very polemic topics in some jurisdictions, such as value capture and risk sharing. I'm sure we'll get back to these topics later in this WebEx. But Rafael, please share your point of view on what are the plans in Peru for this COVID and after COVID, because infrastructure it's longer than that.
Hi, thank you very much, Nacho. It's a pleasure to be here with Daniel and Marta. I think these are great spaces and channels to discuss and share our thoughts. I want to thank KPMG for inviting me to join this panel. well, first about Proinversión, as you know, I'm the executive director for Proinversión, which is our government P3 agency in Peru. Unlike some other P3 agencies, our mandate is focused on the development, structuring, and transaction phase. We don't have many touch points with the projects that are already either in construction or operational phase. That stage is typically managed by other agencies. So my concerns are mostly, and challenges are mostly on the about the procurement process, about the PPP procurement process, and less so about the projects that are already in execution. A little bit about Proinversión. Well, most of you know that it's the P3 agency that has been in operation for almost 20 years now. There's a lot of experience procuring highways, ports, airports, water and sanitation, rail and power and energy projects. So I would say that we have a lot. Our framework is quite mature. There's a lot of experience in the Peruvian industry, P3 industry. The last 3 years have been relatively slow due to a combination of factors. We are in transition to adapt to a new regulatory framework with more checks and balances established over the last couple of years. There have been some regulatory changes that present some challenges to Proinversión, but we are positive it will result in more robust projects and overall P3 processes. So we are adapting to this new environment. Right before COVID showed up, we were already engaging into two major fronts. I joined Proinversión about 5 months ago, and we engaged first in an effort to prioritize our portfolio of projects, looking to be more realistic and enhancing our project management and governance capabilities. And we also started to strengthen Proinversión as a government P3 structuring agency. This, as I said, in reaction to this new PPP regulatory framework. So we're strengthening our structuring capabilities. We established ambitious goals for us that we now believe will need to be revisited in the context of COVID-19. So how are we reacting on COVID-19? I guess first of all, I would say we're not canceling PPP projects, right? So we're not. Our appetite for PPPs are the same, definitely not less. Our infrastructure gaps have not been reduced because of COVID-19. So we still need natural gas distribution projects like Masificación de Gas Natural, which is a project that we have in the south part of Peru. We still need rail projects like Ferrocarril Huancayo-Huancavelica. We still need transmission lines, highways, toll roads like private and solicited bids presented like Anillo Vial Periférico, water and sanitation, sewage projects, especially water like Obras de Cabecera, hospitals, schools, you name it. So we still need the infrastructure. So if anything, what COVID has made more evident is that we need to do more, and we need to do it faster. COVID has made apparent that we have serious gaps in social infrastructure. It's a shame that some of the projects that we have had in the pipeline for some time, like the hospitals, are not quite there yet. We have not been delivered. So we need to revisit the portfolio to put more effort on social infrastructure like hospitals, water, sewage projects, schools. Private investment in infrastructure services has allowed to close part of the infrastructure gap over the last 20 to 30 years in Peru, there are important improvements, but we're far from where we are supposed to be. We still estimate that we have an infrastructure gap of about $100 billion. So there's a lot to be done, both in coverage of power generation and, well, we did a lot on expanding the coverage of power generation, telecoms, highways, ports, airports. But we still have a challenge in front of us. So what we are concerned about COVID in the near future is understanding how is COVID impacting the market and the ability of bidders to participate in the process that we are about, on the tender processes that we are launching in the next, within the coming months. We want to understand whether there's the scales might need to be delayed to accommodate to the bidders to react. We want to understand whether we're still going to have competitive processes in the current environment. What's the current situation of the bidders? What's the appetite of equity investors and construction and O&M contractors? What is the impact of COVID on the scales, construction cost, and overall risk appetite? So I think we also need to understand how to overcome the challenges that the restrictions on mobility within the country, of course, visiting countries. So maybe we may want to consider virtual reality solutions for site visits. I think these are some of the things that we should be discussing overall. But anyway, I think I've taken probably enough time for this first round. So, but these are some of the concerns that we're facing. But we want to do more than we were thinking before COVID.
Thank you all. We will have time to expand all the first impressions and the first messages that you sent. And one of the key messages coming out of the survey is a clear view from public sector officials from the different countries in the region that the private sector is important to drive efficiencies in infrastructure investment and management. As I mentioned, you are representing countries that in the last years and on a process that is still going on, are doing a number of important reforms in this area of a private investment. Can you summarize what are the main initiatives that your government is doing to enable more private investment? And this time we can start with Rafael. Rafael, what are these reforms and what are you doing to improve private sector and participation, and especially to see that or make sure that these promised efficiencies from the private sector are really delivered? I think you're on mute, Rafael.
I think there are a number of things that we're doing. I would start from what we're doing inside Proinversión. We're strengthening our organization, focusing on our structuring capabilities. We want to bring more predictability on how we address legal and financial aspects inside our P3 contracts. We have engaged in initiatives like the P3 standard contract. We engage with a renowned law firm to help us come up with a standard contract that we can use as a benchmark. So this would give more predictability to the private sector on how we address and manage various issues typically addressed in P3 contracts. We have engaged with, as a matter of fact, with KPMG in helping us developing the financial structuring guide to help have a benchmark and some more consistency in how we address and come up with a financial structuring on our various projects. we're enhancing our ability to do more project management and scale management of projects within the in the P3 portfolio, in the P3 system. As I mentioned, there were major changes in the regulatory framework over the last couple of years. There are more checks and balances in the system that makes our role more intense, as we have more touch points with the finance ministry, with the sectors, with the transportation ministry, with the regulator. But overall, it should be a more robust process. So I think this would give more comfort to the market and to the investors that we are developing transparent and robust and well-structured projects that are more baked and mature when they reach the market. So I think that those are some of the key lines of work. And in addition, what we're doing, of course, we're prioritizing and trying to be realistic of what could be accomplished in the near term, to give the signal to the market that we are not being too optimistic. We have to be, we are optimistic in nature, but we are also realistic. We don't want the private sector to lose time on projects that we don't think are going to happen. We are showing the projects that we think can be achieved and delivered to the market on time.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Rafael. Daniel, could you please share your initiatives and same question, how are you ensuring that the private sector delivers their efficiencies or their promised efficiencies and of course, close the gap in infrastructure?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So obviously, despite all the progress that we made, there's still an important infrastructure gap and also improvements to be made in logistics. So on the logistics front, we are 58th among 160 countries on in Latin America on the index, logistics index done by the World Bank. This, of course, affects our competitiveness, our export diversification efforts, our costs of trading, and so on. So we do have big challenges ahead. In light of the COVID emergency, I think that I would just like to tell you a little about how Colombia has reacted to this COVID emergency to set the stage for the recovery via private sector participation. So first, during the emergency, Colombia has issued 56 decrees directly from the sector to respond very effectively to the emergency, and another 71 set of measures to help navigate the emergency. Among them, we have issued measures on tax deferment, on regulatory simplification. We created a logistics center and transport sector, kind of a task force to coordinate action and to avoid the sector from stalling. We extended concession agreements automatically. We provided liquidity to firms. We recognized the costs incurred for biosecurity measures. So all of these measures were put in place to kind of help the sector continue working on those projects that were ongoing and to avoid both the transportation and the infrastructure sectors from stopping. We have, as I mentioned, our three main policies that are geared towards attracting and creating a stable, attractive environment for the private sector to participate. In that sense, I'm from the National Planning Department, so we do work a lot, hopefully, on the planning side of things, and we are working currently on these long-term intermodal plans and a long-term railway plan. So we do have this vision of having a roadmap to guide both the public and private sector investments on infrastructure. So I was happy to see that in the survey, at least one of those things didn't resonate with me. That was the planning issue. But of course, we can do better. So we do want to check and review our risk-sharing guidelines. So I think that it's a good policy, but we do want to review it in light of the most recent evidence and most recent best practices. We do want to work on value capture. There's a big challenge in terms of the funds that we need to be able to mobilize the public sector side of things. So there we need at least like 300 billion pesos, and the dollar is at like 3,900 pesos per dollar. So we can figure out how many dollars that is, right? In terms of the projects, so we have a portfolio of projects that are interesting in the sense that they do cover all of these different modes of transportation. Among them, we have the Canal del Dique. That's a very important project on waterways that connect the Caribbean, the ports on the Caribbean with the interior of the country. So
one more minute, Daniel. Sorry to interrupt. Okay. You've got 1 more minute before Marta starts explaining.
Absolutely.
That. Sorry to interrupt.
So we have Canal del Dique. We have all the projects on the rivers, the Magdalena, the canals that connect to the ports. We have our big rural roads project, and longer term, we are thinking about how to connect the west with the east of the country. Most of the roads and transportation ways in Colombia connect the north with the south. So I think that's an interesting development. It's very long term, but in the meantime, we do have this large portfolio of projects, both connecting cities. One, the 5G projects, closing the remaining 4G projects, and this involves both big highways and rural roads. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Marta, we're starting to run out of time, and but feel free to explain us what you've got at fingertips for the private sector participation and how to ensure that the efficiencies are delivered.
Perfect. So I believe it's important in this crisis to consider some immediate answers from the government side to the concessionaires and PPPs that we already have investing in Brazil. So I believe Brazil was very fast in giving some answers, in talking about the rebalancing of contracts, in evaluating that it is, yes, a possibility to rebalance contracts for the losses of those concessionaires during this crisis. Plus, we took many measures, such as postponing some obligations and payments from those concessionaires to make sure they can keep on providing the services and investing in infrastructure even during this crisis. We also had some changes in our legislation to make sure we could provide all this help to the concessionaires, plus the standstill of some of them, their financing the contracts. So many answers, let's say prompt answers, to make sure those that already invest in Brazil keep on investing and keep on going with the contracts and the public services. To make sure we have as many private investments we need after this crisis, we are moving forward with, let's say, all the projects that we're structuring. So we have two large public banks in Brazil that help us in this structuring effort for the PPPs in Brazil in different sectors. We have Caixa Econômica Federal, a public bank, and BNDES, our developing bank. Both of them have a big structure to help PPI with all the feasibility studies, public hearings, and all the steps to have those auctions happening as fast as we can to bring investments to Brazil. We already changed the regulation for the public hearings in Brazil to make sure we keep on going with them, but on a virtual basis, so such as webinars and making sure the projects don't stop. And also an important thing is to help the states and municipalities in Brazil to go forward with their partnerships. So at the beginning, PPI, the investment partnership, federal government, was very focused on everything that is federal government's responsibility. So transportation, logistics, energy, and we weren't so much focused on the services that are responsibility of the states, Brazilian states. We have 27 states in Brazil, and the municipalities. We have more than 5,500 municipalities in Brazil. And today, PPI is very focused together with those two banks I mentioned to help those cities and states to make their own projects, their feasibility studies, their bidding documents, to help them go through all the steps needed to have the auction, to have those partnerships happening. And that means including the services of basic sanitation, urban mobility, public lighting, solid waste, and other important sectors such as and my colleagues here, both Rafael and Danielle mentioned what we call social infrastructure. So we're moving forward with more projects of PPPs, hospitals, schools, and even prisons in Brazil, helping the states and the municipalities to move forward with those PPPs and projects.
Thank you very much, Marta. Certainly, I wasn't wrong when I said that we could talk about infrastructure for more than an hour, and we are really running out of time. Please, could you summarize, Marta, again with you in a minute or so, your top priority, the top priority of your country in delivering infrastructure to undertake the COVID crisis? Just 1 minute, minute and a half, maybe.
Thank you. So I'd like to highlight the importance also of the multilateral and international cooperations we have here in Brazil. So the help of World Bank, IDB, IFC, the German agency, GIZ, the French agency, AFD. So together with the Brazilian banks I mentioned, we have a lot of international cooperation to make all those projects go further. Last year, we had 36 auctions in Brazil that represent investments around $100 billion in Brazil. And we need to keep on going without those important PPP infrastructure projects in Brazil. So what we're structuring right now, and we can say our priorities are the sectors. Let's say transportation is very important for us. So we have 22 airports right now being structured for a PPP. The auction must happen in the beginning of next year. We have railways, important railway projects in Brazil going on, such as Ferrogrão, a new greenfield infrastructure from Mato Grosso to Pará to help us with the crop distribution. And this project, Ferrogrão, will probably bring more than $2 billion investments to Brazil. Also, another important railway in Bahia, Fiel, is being structured right now, another PPP. On the highway side, we have more than 18,000 kilometers of highways being structured also for PPPs in Brazil. And in ports, also many investments being structured right now. And I would highlight the Port of Santos, most important port of Latin America. We're structuring a full concession of the Port of Santos, and this auction will probably happen between 21 and 22. On the energy side, we have many projects on oil and gas, mining, energy generation, and it's important to say we have very green energy generation projects in Brazil, transmission lines and all that. Another important project is the 5G. It has been mentioned here today. We expect to bring more than $5 billion investments to Brazil with this auction on radio frequency. And we have national parks, forests, and all the social infrastructure I mentioned. So I believe the portfolio of Brazil is very rich in opportunities, and we believe we can bring all those investments to Brazil as fast as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Daniel, what about Colombia?
So I think that our longer-term policies set the roadmap for the challenges ahead in terms of intermodality, in terms of trade facilitation, in terms of urban and regional mobility and value capture. Those three things, plus this portfolio of projects to connect all the regions of Colombia to our production centers and our ports and trade centers is the big challenge ahead. Maximizing the use of our PPP framework, developing this framework in order to better assess risks, to improve the production line process of these PPP projects from inception to execution. Very interestingly, and maybe that's the last point to point out, is that during the crisis, we also had a very interesting exercise of regulatory improvement and simplification. The regulator in charge in Colombia held a process with the private sector to identify those rules and regulations that were obsolete to be able to scrap them. So I think that's something very interesting going forward. And of course, all these public-private spaces of dialogue. We have a committee on logistics, a committee, an intersectorial commission on infrastructure, where we try to better articulate all the sectors involved. So I think we have the institutions and the framework to be able to articulate these efforts between the public and the private sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and sorry for that interruption. Rafael, just a quick wrap up before we can summarize everything. And again, this infrastructure give us we can use hours and hours to discuss around the infrastructure and how could we help the economic in the region.
Sure. Thank you very much, Nacho. I think I would summarize in saying just that, first, to clarify, we continue to push the portfolio projects that we announced earlier this year in January. I think there was some misunderstanding of an article a week ago that was misquoted or gave the wrong impression that we were pushing out our portfolio. That's not the case. We continue to push for the project that we have prioritized earlier this year. If anything, we think we should be doing more on social infrastructure projects. We have a more mature and robust P3 process. There sure are opportunities to enhance and to speed up the approval process, but we are working as an agency, as the P3 agency in Peru, to come up with more robust and more mature P3 projects coming to the market.
Okay, so a couple of takeaways before we go. Firstly, importantly, I think there's no doubt that infrastructure has a significant role to play in driving economic growth in the region. Secondly, there are some challenges that need to be overcome to improve infrastructure investment. I think our survey has highlighted slow approval processes, the need for projects to be better structured, the lack of a long-term infrastructure plan in some cases, and the lack of financial resources, to name just a few. Thirdly, the survey also highlights some measures that can be taken to improve the infrastructure environment, including more capacity building, the depoliticization of infrastructure, and the more use of PPPs. Finally, listening to our external speakers, it is clear the significant efforts the three countries are making to tackle these issues, as well as having to operate in the current COVID-19 environment. We also recognize it's an ongoing but equally pressing task for everyone. Okay, finally, in order to wrap up the call, please bear with me as I cover a few final housekeeping items. A replay of today's webcast will be available shortly. Feel free to share this information with your colleagues who weren't able to join us today. We'll also be sending post-event materials afterwards, and in July we expect to release the full results of the survey. On behalf of KPMG and our infrastructure practice, I would like to thank our speakers as well as everyone who joined the webcast today. If you need further information, feel free to contact any one of us using the contact information on your screen. Thanks all and enjoy the rest of your day.